I'm Marjory O'Toole. I'm the executive director here. About 8 years ago, for graduate school, I started to seriously take a look at Black history in Little Compton. I wanted to write a term paper on slavery. I became so engrossed in the material and felt so strongly that there was an important story there that needed to be shared, that with the support of the board of directors, we turned it into a year-long public history program that we presented in 2016, and we continue that work today. So the results of that project were a 320-page book on the personal histories of enslaved, indentured, and newly free people in Little Compton, a traveling exhibit. It was a special exhibition here. The panels travel. It's been in several locations in Providence, and it is still possible for it to travel. And a variety of public programs, many that took place in 2016, and then talks like this one tonight that continue in the future. And our goal is in doing this project and continuing to do programs is that we think as a historical society, it is important and very appropriate that we share accurate historical content so that all of us can form well-educated opinions and take action today on topics that are meaningful to us. Today, you're going to hear and see a lot of old-fashioned words, words that we don't use in conversation any longer. These words are important because they have very specific meanings that help us understand the history of the time. That's why I continue to use them, and that's why you'll hear them tonight. The meaning of these words have changed over time, and we'll try to explain that as we go along. And in a few cases, the meaning of the words is local, specific to Little Compton. An example of a local word, the best example of a local word is mulatto, which means a person of mixed race. In Little Compton, that word is used for every possible combination of race in the 18th century. There is another word called mustee, which means someone who is both Indian and Negro. The word mustee was never used in any Little Compton documents, even though people in other communities used it to describe people in Little Compton. So the record keepers in Little Compton made a choice, for reasons I don't understand, not to use the word mustee and to use the word mulatto instead. So different words mean different things in different communities, and meaning changes over time. You see the word black on the screen. That is from a document that was written in 1763. At that time, that word black referred to a family who was being quarantined during an epidemic, a smallpox epidemic. The dad was always described as a Negro, the mom was always described as an Indian, and the two girls were always described as mulatto children. All four of them were described under the umbrella of Black persons. So in 1763, in Little Compton, Black meant anyone who wasn't white. And if you want to talk specifically about people of African descent, that was Negro. And so we'll be using those words very specifically in order to make sure the meaning of the old documents is conveyed. So tonight is an anniversary. It is the anniversary of Kate Hillard securing her freedom. Kate was the last person enslaved in Little Compton. We know that to be true because of census records that show 2 enslaved people in 1810 and 0 enslaved people in 1820. We have Kate's freedom records from 1816, and the census from 1810 tells us who the owners or the head of the household was for the two families in town at that time who owned enslaved people. The other one, coincidentally, was Kate's husband, Prince Grinnell. So Kate's owner died. In his will, he gave Kate her freedom. And he wrote, and that's the document that you see here, "I furthermore give my Black woman Kate her freedom immediately after my decease, but in case she should at any time afterward become chargeable to my estate, I order my grandson William Hillard to provide for her all things comfortable in sickness and in health, she being obedient unto him and laboring for him so far as she may be able." So this document tells us a lot. In fact, because he's using the word Black, Kate may have been mixed race. He says Kate is free immediately after my decease, but that wouldn't really have gone into effect until his will went through probate, and August 5th is the day that his will was proved or approved through the probate court, the local probate court. She's free, but if she becomes chargeable to my estate, and what does that mean? That means that if Kate cannot take care of herself, cannot provide for herself, then the charges would go to the Hillard family. And if that should happen, David, who was the owner, is really very kindly saying that his grandson William is the one who is in charge of providing those expenses, and that he should do that in a kind way that makes sure Kate is comfortable in her old age. We know that Kate was married to an enslaved man named Prince Hillard. We know they had two boys. And although we don't have an exact birth date for those two boys, they were born at a very particular time in Rhode Island slavery history. They seem to be born in between the first Gradual Emancipation Act and the second Gradual Emancipation Act, which were approximately a year apart. So the first one was in 1784. It was revived in 1785. And based on the records that I have found, I believe it was revised specifically because of Kate Hillard's two children. They appear to be twins because they both sort of appear at the same time. David, the first Gradual Emancipation Act said that children born to enslaved women after March 1st, 1784 were free. David Hillard did not want to pay for the upbringing of Kate's two boys. He thought he had found a loophole in the law, and he thought that the town of Little Compton should pay for their upbringing. The town of Little Compton sent a letter objecting to that to the General Assembly, and lo and behold, a year later, the law was changed for the whole state, and it was very clear that the mother's owner was the one who was to pay for the care and upbringing of all children until the age of adulthood, and in return, that owner would have the benefit of their labor until adulthood. So on 1816, August 5th, Kate became a free woman, and slavery essentially ended in Little Compton. It did not end in the state of Rhode Island until 1843. To me, a date that is amazingly close to the end of slavery in the South. I've given a talk like this many times, maybe 15 times. And normally I tell stories. I tell stories about enslaved people, and I sort of leave it up to the individual to take what they can from the story and get a sense of Northern slavery. Today, because many of you may have heard me talk before, and because some of you are brand new to this subject, or not even from Little Compton, I thought I would do something a little different. And so I have written a list of 12 lessons about Northern slavery that I have learned through my 4 years of heavy-duty research, through the 4 years of presenting this information, because I still learn. I still find new documents. I still learn from other people. Don't worry about all the text on this slide right now. It's too much text for one slide, but we're going to go through these one at a time. Tell a story about a person who I think sort of brings this lesson to life. And after every third slide, after every third point, we're going to take a break and do questions. So if you have questions, send them to Jenna using the chat feature. This talk may go a little longer than usual. When you've had enough, you've had enough. Just sign off, no hard feelings. You're home, you're comfy. You may have other things to do. Do not worry about staying to the bitter end. But for any of you who are especially interested and do want to stay, Jenna and I can stay as long as people are engaged and as long as people have questions. So that would be the very last question section. We're happy to stay even if it's just a few people. We told each other when our bedtimes were, so we'll sign off for bedtime. First lesson that was not a total surprise to me, but I was surprised at how true this was. Early histories of slavery, secondary histories of slavery, especially those written in the 1800s and early 20th century, at least as far as our local history are concerned, simply cannot be trusted. The historians who wrote them were not particularly interested in Black history. They were much more interested in the history of their own families, and on occasion they sort of jotted something down about people of color in Little Compton, but they did not study it seriously. So much of what they left behind was incomplete, sloppy, and that's sort of, you know, accidental mistakes, and we can certainly, you know, understand why that would happen. But then there are also numerous instances where records were purposely changed, stories were purposely, specifically told in ways that are not true in order to create false impressions. And that's where the real trouble lies. Sometimes in a talk, I'll go through each of these points and explain why each was wrong and why it needed to be changed. I'm going to pick just a couple. Some of them we'll talk about these people later on in the talk. But if you see Fred Burley, there is a family genealogy where the author talks about Fred Burley leaving a family. Fred Burley was a free Black man living in Little Compton. He had come up from the North. He had been enslaved, pardon me, he came up from the South, and he had been enslaved in the South. He came up with a Little Compton family returning from the South to the North. He was freed at that time. And the author of the story sort of makes a joke of it. Fred abandoned his young master when he was going out to the gold rush in California and ran off and joined an Indian tribe, and they made him his chief. So in reality, the gold rush was 1849. In 1850, we can find Fred Burley working for another Little Compton family around the corner from the author of the story. So Fred didn't go to the gold rush. Fred may have left the family he was working for, but it was for another Little Compton family. And this story has to change. It has to be written because it's not respectful of Fred. It's not respectful of Indian tribes, who certainly wouldn't just adopt a stranger and make them the chief of the tribe. It's much more accurate and much more important to know that Fred left one family and took a job as a free man with another Little Compton family. The other story that I think is very important, and it actually comes from the same family genealogy, is the issue of to not and Kate their freedom. Almost any time an earlier historian wrote about slavery in Little Compton, they quote this incident of Sylvester Richmond freeing his slaves before the Revolution, very generously freeing his slaves before the Revolution, and they write to Nat and Kate their freedom. This is a partial truth. What we have on the screen is Sylvester Richmond's actual will. So here's a primary source document. And what he says, and I'll sort of summarize, to Nat and Kate their freedom if they can raise their own freedom bonds. Now, a freedom bond was a large amount of money, 50 pounds or 100 pounds, that an owner had to give to the town in which he lived or she lived when he or she freed someone. So just like with Kate Hillard, if she became chargeable, if she became dependent on the town because she couldn't take care of herself, the town would have a pot of money to pay her expenses. It's kind of like a Social Security account. The idea that Sylvester would put that burden on his enslaved people is really hard to understand how that could even be possible. Another document tells us that Kate is an elderly woman. How an elderly enslaved woman is supposed to come up with 100 pounds in order to post the bond for her freedom is really just beyond me. His will goes on that if either Nat or Kate are unable to raise the money of Sylvester's son, Perez Richmond. Well, 2 years later, we see this. This is a runaway advertisement that Perez Richmond wrote for Kate. So that tells us Kate was not able to raise the freedom bond. And it tells us that she was done being an enslaved person, and she ran away from her new owner, Perez Richmond. The advertisement, which would have gone to a newspaper and been published in a newspaper, as well as maybe being tacked up in different places around town, warns people not to shelter Kate. So that tells us that Perez thinks she's hiding with some sympathetic people locally. They lived in Acoxit originally, and Perez eventually lived over on West Main Road. We do not know if Kate was ever found. We do not know if she managed to remain free or was returned to Perez Richmond. But for the last 4 years, I would end my story about Kate by saying she's the only enslaved woman in Little Compton that we know ran away this spring because of the marvelous, ever-increasing number of old newspapers and documents that are being digitized. We found Suki's runaway notice. So 1799, here's our second woman from Little Compton who ran away from her owner. By my calculations, about 5% of the enslaved people in Little Compton ran away, self-emancipated. Little Compton had about 200, Little Compton had slightly over 200 enslaved people that we have been able to document so far. I think that number is a low estimation. Slavery in Little Compton began in 1674 when Benjamin Church came to build the first farm. He owned enslaved people and probably had them help in that construction, and it ended with Kate in 1816. About 20% of Little Compton's white families owned enslaved people in 1755. So about 20% of the English households were slave-owning households in 1755. Second lesson that I learned, and again, this was a surprise to me, the first slavery in this area, the first slavery in New England, and really the first slavery up and down, well, between here and South America, was Indian slavery. Not too long ago, many people, myself included, many people who study history, myself included, believed that local Indians were indentured, not enslaved for life. I was in Portsmouth in their town hall reading their old documents, and I read Hannah's bill of sale, 1677. Hannah had been captured during King Philip's War. This was the second time she was being sold. And she had been originally enslaved by Benjamin Church. And now she's being sold to William Wardell, or Wodell. Her paper distinctly says slave for life. Very eye-opening for me. I think very important for us to understand that this was going on with people, women and children from the local tribes. If you look closely at this document, Hannah was required to sign that she was willing to be a slave. Again, very eye-opening and really hard to understand. She signed with a mark. And then there are witnesses, Daniel Wilcox, who is a white man, and Alderman. Alderman is a fairly well-known Native American man who served with Benjamin Church during King Philip's War, and Alderman is the person who actually killed King Philip. Alderman was given 100 acres of land in the northeast corner of Little Compton. He was given a big 100 acres of land in the corner of Adamsville as his reward for being loyal to the English during King Philip's War. Indian slavery faded as African slavery grew in New England, but Indian slavery did not disappear. It shifted from the enslavement of local Indians, which in general is a very bad idea, because if you enslave someone who lives locally, it's easy for them to run away back to their people, and you also run the risk of the warriors from their village, from their community, coming to you to violently take them back. So there was some danger in enslaving local people. Now, during King Philip's War, the English mitigated that danger by sending many of the men and teenage boys into slavery in the Caribbean and in Europe, so the threat was minimal. But even so, eventually laws were passed. You could not enslave local Indians, but it was still okay to have lifelong enslavement for Native people who were from the South. And they were called a number of things, but they were frequently called Spanish Indians or Carolina Indians. So here we have another runaway notice for Job Almy, who owned land in both Tiverton and Little Compton, and 3 men ran away in 1765. 2 were described as Negroes, and Isaac was described as an Indian. And Job Almy made a point in the runaway notice to make sure that everyone knows that Isaac was the son of a Spanish squaw. That means he's a Spanish Indian, and it's legal and okay for Job to own him at this time. Now, normally, we don't know what happens to runaways. In this particular case, Job Almy's will gives Isaac and Jack their freedom. So Isaac and Jack are 2 of the men who are running away in 1765. The fact that Job is freeing them tells us that somehow they return to Job, either of their own choice to go back, or they were captured and brought back to their masters. Job words that freeing, that emancipation, in an interesting way. He frees them if they behave well, and if they do not lie or steal. But if they do, they're immediately enslaved again. So often we see a freedom that is really a partial freedom. And if the enslaved person or the formerly enslaved person does not follow certain rules, their freedom can be lost again. The third point, Northern slavery was real slavery. And maybe that doesn't seem necessary for me to say, But if you're familiar with the way that Northern slavery has been presented in older histories, it really is important to say. The blue letters are a quote from Benjamin Franklin Wilbur, who is a very good local historian. We owe him an awful lot in Little Compton because he did so much work for us. But this was how he presented slavery in 1970. In Little Compton, the farms were not large, but in South Kingstown, they were more as they were in the South, families having large plantations, slaves to work, racehorses, and dancing masters. South Kingstown was far different from Puritan Little Compton. So he's holding out Little Compton as good compared to South Kingstown, which had real slavery, and the South, which had real slavery. So Franklin Wilbur didn't deny that there was slavery in Little Compton. In a different part of his book, he mentions it, but he makes it very clear, or he tries to make it seem like it was minimal, short-lived, and very kind and gentle. And that's really just not true. Slavery in Little Compton and all throughout New England was racially based. It was lifelong. It was inheritable, which means if your mother was enslaved, you are enslaved when you are born. If your mother's free, then you are free when you are born. It was an oppressive institution, and it was extremely profit-driven. And actually, I just gave you these statistics because I thought I had forgotten to say them earlier, but 140 years of slavery in Little Compton, 20% of the white families were slave owners, and we've identified 200 enslaved people, and I think in time we will identify more. And why do we want to identify them? Because for years we've been able to provide families of English descent with this really sort of glorious genealogy for them to follow right back to England. We can't do that for Portuguese families. We can't do it for other immigrant families. We haven't in the past been able to do it for Native American families or African American families. Now we can start doing that, and it's very rewarding because we do have families coming to us for that information, and we're able to share it. Imperfect, but we can share what we have. So here's my story of a real person for slavery was real, or New England slavery was real slavery. I'd like to talk about Sarah Peabody. This is Sarah's genealogy to the best that we can do it. You'll notice the line to her daughter is dotted because I think it's her daughter, but I can't prove it. But what you see here that you don't see on most genealogies is the addition of all the people who owned or had control over the people of color. And that complicates things tremendously. And you can't really separate the Black families, the Negro families, the Indian families from the white families that had control over them. So we first learn about Sarah Peabody in 1721 in Thomas Gray's will. She's owned by Thomas Gray. He owns 5 enslaved people. Sarah is an adult woman in that sort of cadre of enslaved people. There are 3 children. We don't know if they're Sarah's children, but certainly it's easy to imagine she would have been a mother-like figure for them. Sarah is passed as property in Thomas's will to his son, Dr. Thomas. Not all the 5 enslaved people go to Dr. Thomas. Some of them leave and go to other family members' houses. So Sarah's co-workers or co-enslaved are now leaving her. And they may have been her children, they may not have been her children, we don't know, but now they're being sent to other houses. Dr. Thomas dies in 2 years. He gives Sarah to his sister, Rebecca. Rebecca is a married woman. So her ownership of Sarah immediately passes to her husband, John. John Peabody is now Sarah's legal owner. John died, and while she is owned by John Peabody, Sarah marries an enslaved man named Caesar, who's owned by Nathaniel Church, in 1731. And I think they have a daughter named Jane. John Peabody dies in 1767, and the inventory takers come to his household and assign a pound amount to everything he owns. Sarah is listed in his property because she is property. Her value is 0. It is always hard to see a human being listed as property in a probate inventory. It is especially hard to see a person listed with a value of 0. And what that meant was that in the opinion of the inventory takers, Sarah was either too elderly or too disabled in order to do productive work. She is now not an asset, she is a liability. In short, the Peabody heirs abandoned her. They had an obligation. They had a legal obligation, and they had a community custom obligation to care for their families, elderly, enslaved people. They did not do that. The town of Little Compton had to care for Sarah. She became chargeable to the town. In 1772, they decide at a town meeting that they will no longer care for the elderly Negro woman, Sarah Peabody. And that implies to me that they really felt someone else should be taking care of her, namely the Peabody family. For reasons we don't really understand, Thomas Church, the grandson of Benjamin Church, takes Sarah into his household. And at this point, the town council is referring to Sarah with not just one name, which is how the town would refer to an enslaved person, but 2 names, Sarah Peabody. Normally when we see a person, a Negro person with 2 names, that means that they are free. And so my hope is that Sarah is now a free woman at this point in time. Why did Thomas Church take her in? I really don't know, but my guess, and this is all very intuitive, is we know Thomas Church owned Jane. I think Jane was Sarah's daughter. One of the reasons why I think Jane was Sarah's daughter is that Jane named her son Caesar after her father. Again, all intuitive. I cannot prove that, but with the history, with genealogy for enslaved people in New England, sometimes intuition is all you have to go on. Sarah joined the Church family, and she stayed there for a very long time. They moved to Dighton. Thomas Church dies in 1797. Sarah is still alive. She's a 90-year-old woman, free, living in Dighton with the Church family, and in his will, Thomas Church assigns his grandson, and I don't know how to say this name, Gamaliel, to care for Sarah and keep her in comfort in her old age. So that is a very long, very detailed story of one enslaved woman from Little Compton. We don't know much about her personality, her hopes, her desires, but because of probate records, we can tell that this woman changed hands, really almost more times than we can count. So this is still the 3rd point, but I just really want it to hit home. Northern slavery was a brutal, dehumanizing institution. It permeated every aspect of early American life in New England, and it still has negative ramifications today. I think this is equally important. Despite the horrors of slavery, enslaved people repeatedly found the strength and developed the skills to survive, and in many cases build better lives for themselves and their children. And if you do more work, more research, more reading, you're going to see words like agency, resistance, and creative survival whenever there is an example of someone overcoming the oppression of Northern slavery, or at least surviving the oppression of Northern slavery. Point number 4. In colonial America, slavery was legal. It was Christian. Your clergy people were telling you that owning enslaved people was good because you were bringing them to Christ, and therefore to salvation. You were saving their souls. Slavery was extremely profitable, and slavery was really key to an owner's success. Owning an enslaved person allowed you to leave the farm and go do government work and excel in government work. It allowed you to leave the farm and go be a superior military leader. Do lead work for your neighbors so you could earn income over and above what you earned on the farm. It was truly a key to success. If your daughter was getting married, there was no better than an enslaved person. An enslaved woman to help around the house, an enslaved boy to help around the house. It was the very best gift you could give. Enslaved people were typically a white family's most valuable possession, and the most prominent, most successful people in Little Compton were the slave owners. The probate inventory that you see here is for the Reverend Richard Billings. He owned 2 Negroes. You can see them where that blue arrow is. You can see that they are the most expensive things, but expensive, and I shouldn't say things. Those 2 human beings were his 2 most valuable items of property. 300 pounds, so 150 pounds each. His congregation probably chipped in to help buy him enslaved people. We also know that wealthy slave owners would give enslaved children to their friends as gifts. And I think later on we're going to see a document for a girl named Philana. Philana was given as a gift to the local minister. So at the time, during the time of slavery, did anybody think that slavery was bad? No, and certainly enslaved people thought it was bad. The people under oppression thought it was bad. But did the white community, did the free community think that slavery was bad at the time? And the answer is very few did. The Quakers come to mind. Very, very early on, early 1700s, the Quakers say slavery is bad. Quakers are not going to own slaves. Guess what? It was so profitable to own slaves that Quakers owned slaves anyway. They disobeyed their faith because it was just so profitable. And so the Quaker discipline changed. It didn't say, okay, we're going to kick you out because you're slave owners. It said, well, we see you're going to own slaves no matter what, so at least try to be good slave owners. And it wasn't until 1760 that they got more serious and said this really had to stop. A few Baptist ministers were saying no slavery. We have a wonderful example at the Old Stone Church in Tiverton. The minister's name was Peleg Burroughs. He left a journal, which if you're interested in primary source documents, his journal is just fantastic, and it is published and printed, so it's available. He would from time to time preach that slavery was bad in the homes of slave owners. That was very brave of him, especially when you understand that Baptist ministers didn't get a salary. They relied on donations from people. He was getting donations in order to feed his children from the people he was telling they needed to stop slavery. Very brave. We don't have the word abolition at this time. We have the word anti-slavery. Right before the revolution, during the revolution, after the revolution, the anti-slavery movement grew. There was an anti-slavery group in Providence after the revolution. Peleg Burrows was invited to join that group, but very few people were publicly saying that slavery was bad. And then a really hard question that I asked the kids who came to our slavery exhibit: were slave owners automatically bad people for owning slaves? And, you know, that's a question, everyone's going to have a different opinion on that subject. I think the important thing to remember is that at the time, slave owners had a lot of sources, a lot of voices telling them that slavery was good. The slave trade, on the other hand, in reality was worse than I think we can even imagine. This is not my area of expertise. If you're interested, there are excellent books on the subject, and I encourage you to explore more. But what I can say from my research is that not only Newport and Bristol was after the Revolution, but not only Newport, but Little Compton and Tiverton were tightly tied into the slave trade. Numerous Tiverton men, numerous Little Compton men were ship owners, slave ship investors, slave ship captains. The conditions on the ship were inhuman, abuses of every kind. The receipt is a receipt for Nathaniel Briggs for a voyage that he was in charge of in 1785, and it shows a list of some of the enslaved people that he purchased in Africa on that voyage. Nathaniel Briggs of Tiverton, highly respected member of the community, very wealthy man. He is personally responsible for 18 slave voyages that brought 2,166 people from Africa against their will to the Caribbean, and in some cases to New England. He is also personally responsible for 267 deaths during that middle passage from Africa to the Caribbean. The fact that he was involved in the slave trade had no negative impact on his reputation or his business dealings in Tiverton. He was a very well respected, very accepted member of the community. And the most concerning thing of all, when we dive into Nathaniel Briggs, is that the Transatlantic Slavery Database has numbers for his voyages that he reported on tax documents. We have a logbook at Brown University, has a logbook from one of his voyages on the Sally, not the famous Sally, but a different Sally. He underreported by 100 people. So in one instance, he underreported by 100 people. Maybe it was a mistake, maybe it was an oversight, but I don't think so. I think that slave traders, in order to save tax dollars, probably habitually underreported on their voyages. And the numbers we have from those tax documents and from the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database are way, way lower than they should have been. And I'm just realizing that I was supposed to stop after 3 for questions, and I went too far. So I will definitely stop after this one. The gravestone belongs to Oliver Earle, a Little Compton man who was a ship owner, a slave ship owner, and a slave ship captain. It may be too difficult for you to read his inscription, but he died on Bent's Island of a fever on the coast of Africa in 1803. So he died on one of his slaving voyages. And that slave trade history is in our cemetery for everyone to see. Okay, so sorry, I missed my number, 0.3 question period, but if there are any questions, I'm more than happy to try and answer them now.
I have one so far, and that is, what is a dancing master in this period?
Say that again, John.
What is a dancing master?
Oh,
You had
oh.
referenced it in
Oh,
the
sure.
Benjamin Franklin Wilbur quote.
Okay. So, believe it or not, even in New England, where we think everyone would be so stodgy, dancing school was a big deal in the 1700s. And you would pay good money to send your young adults to dancing school with a dancing master to learn how to dance so that they could socialize with the right people and attract, an appropriate marriage partner. So a dancing master is a dancing school teacher, and it was really kind of wildly popular. So Newport would have for sure had dancing masters. And I see a dancing school in the town hall in Little Compton in the 1800s. So we might be a little behind Newport, but we had a dancing school too at one time.
There is another question about the negative ramifications today, but I think we'll be getting to that later as we go along. So I'm gonna put a pin in that for now, if that makes sense to you, Marjory. In the screen showing now, what are the numbers in the right-hand column?
Those are, I believe, the prices. But it's hard to say what the type of payment was.
Mm-hmm.
In Africa, you would pay for enslaved people. Mostly I see people paying for enslaved people with gold and ounces of gold. It's a little hard to figure out because I see 122 for the first person, 9 for the second person, 60, and then a lot of 2s. I do think it is a record of cost, but I can't interpret that in a way that makes sense.
All right.
Okay.
That was all the questions I have for now.
So why don't I'll do 6 and 7 and I'll stop after 7 and we'll just try to catch up a little bit that way.
Okay.
Enslaved people were legally person and property. Jane is probably the best example of this. Again, we learn about her from the will of her owner, Thomas Church. And this Thomas Church was Benjamin Church's son. His will was written in 1740, or he died in 1746. So he wrote, "It is my will further that if my Negro woman Jane, after my decease, should want to be sold, my executor may dispose of her and to buy another for the family until my son Benjamin comes of 21 years, and then to be his." Jane is clearly property. She's listed in his will along with all of his other belongings, and he is inherited by the next generation, just like one would inherit a carriage or a gun or a chair. She is absolutely property. But Thomas is also recognizing her personhood here by giving her a choice to be sold or not. And I've never seen a will like this before. I've never seen an enslaved person being given the choice to be sold or not. Now, I've thought about this phrase a lot. Sometimes in old documents, the word want really means need, not want. So if Jane should need to be sold, maybe because we don't have enough money to pay our bills, sell her. But I honestly don't think that's the case here, because Thomas is immediately saying, buy another enslaved person, buy another enslaved woman. They had the money to buy a new person, so they didn't need the money from selling an old person. I really do think they were giving Jane a choice. For years, a couple of years, this is all that I knew about Jane, and it really stuck with me. I was intrigued by this. A colleague sent me this document out of the blue, and it answered so many questions. Prince Bailey of Little Compton, a Negro man, and Jane, a Negro woman belonging to Thomas Church of Dighton, intention to marry in 1778. I know Prince Bailey. He was enslaved in Little Compton. He became free. He's using a last name. He's described with a last name because he is now a free man. He was owned by the Bailey family. Jane is still enslaved at this time because she has no last name, and it says she belongs to Thomas Church. Thomas Church so Jane chose to stay with the Church family. That answers that question, and here she is 30 years later, still with the Church family. The Churches moved to Dighton for safety during the Revolution. They took their servants with them. Prince followed Jane to Dighton, and they were married in the English, according to legal custom there. But what's important to know is they already had a 19-year-old son. They were a couple, and they were next door neighbors. So one of the big reasons why Jane may have stayed with the Church family is because the man that she loved lived on the farm next door. Number 7, an enslaved person's treatment varied from household to household. It depended on the personality of the owner and the white members of the family, and it depended on the personality of the enslaved person. Were they someone whose strategy to survive involved agreeing and complying? Were they somebody who decided to do the opposite and resist and be challenging and challenge authority? Certainly a kind, easygoing master and a compliant enslaved person would lead to a more peaceful existence than a cruel owner and a resistant enslaved person. And that could be a daily abusive situation. The records show evidence of an entire spectrum of treatment, from treatment that honestly looks kind and loving, at least to an outsider, to treatment that was incredibly cruel and abusive. Marjory Bailey was freed by the Bailey family and given an inheritance by her female owner that was equal to the type of inheritance you would give a beloved daughter. That inheritance, the goods that Marjory was given, ensured that she would be comfortable for the rest of her life. And when Marjory died, she gave her belongings, including a significant amount of money that she had managed to save, back to the white children in the Bailey family, children that she had taken care of for many years because their mother had died young. So that is an example of what seems like kindness and respect and affection to me. Saul and his wife, different situation. A situation of respect. Saul was given the entire management of his owner's farm. When ox salesmen came, they dealt with Saul. They didn't deal with the owner because the owner was away earning good money and Saul was managing the farm. That seems wonderful. But Saul and his wife's children were taken away and given to the owner's friends. Unbelievable, heart-wrenching. Given to wealthy, prominent families nearby in Little Compton, and to Saul and his wife, who saw on a regular basis children of color being taken away from their parents. There may have been a little consolation in the fact that these kids were close by and in what would have been considered some of the best families in Little Compton. So this very odd combination of respect and authority, responsibility for Saul, and still the absolute control of the owner to be able to take children and do what he wanted with them. Aaron and Moses is an example of very clear-cut abuse. Their owner rented them out when he didn't have work for them on the farm because he didn't want to feed them in the wintertime when there wasn't enough work. The person who rented them complained that they were improperly clothed in the wintertime, their shoes with no shoes and such rags for clothing that it was impossible to ask them to work because they were simply too cold to work. Their owner handled that situation by sending the men out to sea. So here are two young men who had only ever worked on a farm before, and now they're being sent on a ship with no experience. The worst case of abuse that I have read in the records locally was actually committed by a Quaker family in Westport, in the Dartmouth area. There's lots of documentation of this. The enslaved man is never named. He was stripped, he was hung by his hands, and he was beaten severely. They put him to bed, and he died 3 days later, and they thought maybe he died because of the beating. So absolute brutality. And the only consolation in that horrible story is that the Quaker community in Dartmouth recognized that this was an atrocity, and they removed the man had already been removed from the Quaker meeting from past atrocities, but they removed his wife as well because she witnessed this and did not speak up and did not stop it. So there was a degree, a threshold of proper behavior that was expected by the community. And if slave owners were cruel and they were discovered, the community would at times sanction them. Gaining freedom to enslaved people mattered tremendously. And perhaps more often than you think, they were able to find a way to secure their freedom in this local area. They could run away, self-emancipate, and I do think about 5% of the enslaved people here did that. They could volunteer, and it really was volunteer. In some cases, it was volunteer for military service. And during the Revolution, for a short period of time, they were instantly freed when they volunteered and agreed to do a 3-year term. They could write a contract with their owner. Different situations, different contracts, but in most cases, it was the enslaved person buying themselves. I will give you 150 pounds and I will buy my freedom. A number of owners, we've talked about a few tonight, rewarded their enslaved people with their freedom in their wills or during their lifetime. And they would say, you know, something like for their loyal service, and they would free them. Sometimes enslaved people were purchased by loved ones, and we'll talk about Sippo and Kate in just a minute because that's what Sippo did. He purchased his wife and 9 of his children. If an enslaved man married a free woman, their children would be born free. It didn't necessarily help the man, but at least he assured the next generation would be free. Sometimes enslaved people became free because they were abandoned, and we saw that with Sarah Peabody. In 1760, a Quaker discipline or a Quaker rule came down from the Quaker authorities in this area. Members of the faith could no longer own slaves. The folks in Dartmouth kind of acted on that rather quickly. The folks in Newport took 15 years to finally free their slaves. But in 1755, we see 18 emancipations, boom, 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 from Quaker families who all freed them, who freed their enslaved people at the same time. No evidence of Little Compton Quakers owning enslaved people. The closest is the Bowen family in Tiverton, who in 1775 freed 4 enslaved people. And then finally, gradual emancipation. We talked about that a little bit. That was a law in Rhode Island and actually it was 1784. So I have it wrong here, 1784. It was an act, and I did say it briefly, so I won't dwell on it. Children born after March 1st were free. They were indentured. Ultimately, the mother's owner had to provide for them until they were 21, and they got the benefit of the child's labor until they were 21. So it was a forced indenture until the age of 21. The mother was still enslaved. If you were born February 28th, 1784, you were still a slave for life. Someone born the next day was free. If you were twins and one of you was born February 28th and the other one was born after midnight on March 1st, one of you was enslaved and one of you was free. So brutal for the people who were born before the cutoff. But what we see after that point is a huge uptick in manumissions. White families started to free their enslaved people after the Gradual Emancipation Act, in part, and in large part, because part of the act removed the requirement that you posted a freedom bond. So now instead of it costing you $100 to free an enslaved person, now it was free to free an enslaved person, and you and your enslaved person would go in front of the town council and prove that that enslaved person could take care of themselves, would not become chargeable to the town, and the town council would agree to set them free. So Sippo and Kate, you see their cellar hole here. This is in Weedamo Woods in Tiverton. Sippo was enslaved in Little Compton by the Cook family. Kate was enslaved in Tiverton, close enough that they could visit. Minimal work was done on Sunday. If you were enslaved and married and living in different households, Sunday was an opportunity to visit with your family. Sippo's owner freed him shortly after the revolution for services rendered. Kate was still enslaved, and she was still enslaved for about 11 years. Sippo worked for 11 years, taking whatever work he could. We actually see him working for the slave captain, Nathaniel Briggs, and saving his money, and eventually purchasing Kate and purchasing 9 of their 11 children. And so now they have a household of 11 people who all in the past had been supported by their white owners. Now they have to support themselves. They're living in this little house, and Sippo and Kate have to figure out how to support a family of 11 doing the labor that they're able to do. Freedom was important. It's also important to remember that not every person of African descent, not every person who was described as a Negro was enslaved. There were free Negro people in New England from very early times. In Little Compton, our evidence of this is the probate documents of James Fogue's so-called free Negro man, and he died in 1729. So you'll see that his name is in quotation marks. This is written exactly as it was written by the person who did his probate inventory. It tells us a lot. It tells us that James was a Negro man. It tells us that James was free. And the clerk put free in there on purpose because sort of the normal state for Negro people at this time was to be enslaved. So it's unusual that James is free, and the clerk wants us all to be aware of that and alert to that. He has two names, another indication that he's free. And Phobes was the name of a wealthy Little Compton family, and I think it's a very safe assumption that he was formerly enslaved by William Phobes, who was one of the first proprietors of Little Compton. I think the thing that is most interesting and very different is the so-called, in parentheses. The clerk is bringing to our attention that Phobes isn't really James's name, that it's something the community has taken to calling him because of his association with the Phobes family. This is James's inventory, lots of household goods. He lived in his own house, but he didn't own the property. His house was built on the highway. And in the Little Compton town records, we see over and over again, poor people getting in trouble for building their houses on public land, building their houses on the highway, and carriages and wagons unhappy because they have to go around these poor people's houses. Lots of normal household goods, a couple of things that really grab our attention. James owns half a windmill. I think that's fascinating. James also owns in Little Compton, we have a free Negro man who owns half a windmill. It says my internet connection is unstable. I hope it's not bad. Well, it seems better now. Free Negro man, he owns half a windmill. He also has his own indentured servant, a mixed race child. Fascinating and definitely surprising to me when I came across this. Philana, this is the child that was given to the Reverend Mass Shepherd as a gift. And Philana was born in January of 1784. She missed gradual emancipation. She missed automatic freedom by 2 months. Like, heartbreaking, that poor child. But like many owners at the time, Mass Shepherd freed her. It was free. It did not cost him anything to free her. It was starting to seem like the right thing to do, and more people were doing it. He did not free her immediately. He freed her when she was 21. So he had the benefit of her work until that time. And it also was an assurance that she would be cared for. You know, a 14-year-old girl, a 15-year-old girl might not be able to care for herself and would become chargeable to the town. So here's a question that I have thought about many times. And often when people are giving a talk on Northern slavery, and I'm going to say we're very careful not to present Northern slavery as better than Southern slavery. We really want to get the point across that it was real slavery, that it was horrible, totally stripped people of their rights. But I have thought about this a lot, and I think about it in different categories. So was it better to be enslaved in the North than in the South? This is where I've sort of landed. As an individual, I think it's a firm no. If you have an abusive master, it does not matter to you one bit whether you're being tormented in the North or tormented in the South. It's just the same. But if we think about slavery as an institution, a broader institution, then I think yes. I think there were some institution-wide practices in the North that made slavery in the North a little less bad than slavery as an institution in the South. And there is evidence of those practices. It was less common. Fewer white families owned slaves in the North. A smaller percentage of white families owned slaves in the North than did in the South. It ended earlier than it did in the South. Northern slavery recognized the personhood and the fact that an enslaved, the personhood of the enslaved more than Southern slaveholders or Southern officials did. And there are numerous examples of that in the records. Enslaved people in the North were encouraged to learn how to read because as the head of a household, a head of a Christian household, a Protestant household, you wanted everyone in your household, regardless of gender, regardless of race, to learn how to read their Bible so they would be a good Christian and they could go to college, go to heaven. So you taught your enslaved people to read, not to write, not to do math, unless they were going to manage your farm for you, but reading was encouraged. Enslaved people in the North could own property, and we see that in the probate documents. Most often a bed. A bed was a very big deal. Many enslaved people in the North had access to legal marriages performed by a justice of the peace or performed by a minister. Community members in the North would report abuse to the authorities, and the abusers could be sanctioned. Not always, but it did happen. Northern courts would listen to people of color and take their testimony into consideration when they were making decisions. And sometimes they ruled in favor of people of color. There were more paths to freedom in the North than there were in the South. And we see a higher percentage of Northern enslaved people finding a way to freedom than we do in the South. And finally, newly freed people were welcome to stay in the community. In the South, every state was different, but in the South, many states required that a newly freed slave leave within 6 months. You could not stay near your family if you were freed in the South. That was different and I think important here. All right, so again, I missed my promise of questions, but why don't we see if there's any questions now?
I have so many questions.
Okay.
Okay. Prior to gradual emancipation, do we have a sense of what percentage of slave owners freed their slaves upon the owner's death rather than willing them to their next of kin?
Let me just think for a minute, and I'm going to give you a really rough, off the top of my head estimate, just based on my own research. I'm going to say it happened like 1 out of 10 times, 10% of the time.
Okay.
And often if the enslaved person was old, right? So wasn't a huge sacrifice for the white family to give up the work, the remaining work life of an older person.
Okay. Also prior to gradual emancipation, do we know the motivation behind why an owner would free their slaves upon their death rather than put them in their estate?
There could be many reasons. Here are 2. They were being decent people and rewarding someone who had worked closely with them and served them for years and years and years, and it was a just reward for good service. That's one explanation. The second explanation is that they wanted to avoid the costs involved in supporting an elderly slave until their death. That is less noble, but if the enslaved person wanted to be free, they would take it.
Has the Historical Society received any inquiries from families of enslaved people about reparations from the town or of Little Compton families who profited from slavery?
Not received. I have met with several descendants of enslaved people. We share information. Reparations have not come up.
Okay. Is it possible that Marjory Bailey was treated like family because she was family biologically?
Oh, maybe. I mean, that's always possible, maybe.
Do we have any knowledge in all of the documentation of what caused the unnamed enslaved man's beating by the Quaker owner?
The Quaker owner had a previous record where he severely beat an Indian man.
Mm-hmm.
I think he was an abuser.
When an enslaved person self-emancipated in town, were town officials tasked with looking for the person, or was this search something that other white people and slave owners in town just took on themselves?
Town officials had no responsibility to conduct the search. We see the news, so you probably left town. You know, Kate being sheltered locally was probably rare, and probably because of her sex and her age, she didn't really run like a young man would run. Mm-hmm. The advertisements, it's advertised broadly. You'd advertise so that people in New Bedford could see it, Newport could see it, Boston could see it, and you offered a reward. So because of the reward, you're hoping that someone is going to spot your enslaved person in a tavern in the clothing that you've described and capture them like a citizen's arrest and turn them over to the sheriff in that community. And so that's where the town would get involved, because the sheriff was a town appointed position. But it was typically a private citizen who wanted the reward.
Has Sippo and Kate's cellar hole in Tiverton ever been archaeologically excavated?
By the way, Sippo and Kate's story, their emancipation papers, were brought to me by their descendant, Cheryl Lewis Martin, who is a white woman. Cheryl was doing her genealogy and was kind of surprised to see Indians and Negroes in her genealogy, because she thought she was white, and she asked her mom, or she asked her parents, and they were like, oh yeah, we don't really talk about it, but yeah, you have both Black and Indian ancestors. That's pretty common in Little Compton. Sometimes every other family in town knows that history, but maybe the children in that family haven't been told the history yet because it's a gossipy thing. I am thrilled that I'm thrilled that we live at a time where Cheryl can be legitimately excited and proud of her ancestors, and she's going to apply for Daughters of the American Revolution membership because of Sippo Cook's service in the Revolution.
And at the beginning, what you were saying was cut off a little bit, I think, because it didn't recognize I had stopped talking.
Oh, okay.
And so you said it has not been archaeologically excavated.
It is not. That site has not been excavated, and it would be really interesting to do that work.
Are you able to share the sources found and used for researching these enslaved people's histories?
Yes. So, the book that has all these stories is really well footnoted. So if you do the footnotes, you should be able to find all the sources yourself. In some cases, I have more information than made it into the book. So if you're particularly interested in a particular person and I have more information, I'm happy to share that. I think sharing and collaboration is absolutely essential to really piecing this history together accurately. Some of the best stories in this book are only good stories because other people shared their research with me, and I am incredibly grateful for that.
Have you found in your research any connections to slavery in Jamestown?
You know, I work for the Little Compton Historical Society. It is rare that I get to go beyond the boundaries of Little Compton. When you are researching people of color, you can't pay as much attention to boundaries as you do with white landowning families. So I dipped my toes into Westport and Dartmouth, into Tiverton, I was about to say no to Jamestown, and then it just occurred to me that the whole Aaron Biggs story is a Jamestown story. So Aaron Biggs, and I'm purposely saying Biggs, not Briggs. Aaron Biggs was the famous indentured servant, child of color, in the burning of the Gatsby story. There's pages and pages of his testimony at the Rhode Island Historical Society. He is supposed to be, they call him a Negro in the documents. Ezra Stiles was a minister in Newport who did an awful lot with the Native American communities in the mid-1700s. Ezra Stiles says that Aaron Biggs is the son of an Indian woman from Little Compton. So that's our connection. I don't know if that's true, but that is what Ezra Stiles said, and that would be our Jamestown connection.
And this is, I'm just reading verbatim what people are saying. I wonder if newly free people could stay in the community and were afforded other advantages. How did LC become so non-diverse and predominantly white?
It was allowed to stay in the community. I don't think it was desirable. And I think by their own volition, people chose to leave. Mm-hmm. So different than being forced to leave. If you lived in the South, you would have been forced to leave. Mm-hmm. We see smaller and smaller numbers of people of color once slavery starts to dwindle, because Little Compton was not a great place for a newly freed person to live. For a while, it's pretty clear that you weren't allowed to purchase property. There's a man named Fortune Gray, who I'm almost certain was not allowed to purchase property, and the Reverend Mass Shepherd purchased property for him and let him live there. That changed. We'll talk about Primus Collins a little bit later. Primus was able to purchase property. If you want to farm on someone else's land for low wages, that was pretty much what you could expect as a free Black man in Little Compton. Women could work as domestic servants in a house, I'm sure, for low wages. Much more tempting, I think, to try your luck in Newport, New Bedford, Providence, where there is going to be a community of color, more marriage partners, more friends, really vibrant social organizations, schools, social clubs, groups, like advancement groups that you could join, especially in Newport. It was a much more stimulating, vibrant community in the cities with more opportunities.
Where did Little Compton families buy slaves?
So some were born right here. That's a really good question, and I'm glad someone asked that, because I don't think I was going to address it otherwise. Newport, and you would place an order. You would have a relative in Newport who was probably involved in the slave trade. You would tell them that you're looking for a girl around 11 years old, and then when that sailor, when that captain, when that owner conducted a voyage, the captain of the ship would know that, you know, Jim Smith would like an 11-year-old girl, and he would pick someone special out for you. And they would be the very best. The ship would go to the Caribbean. Most of the enslaved people would be sold, but the purposely ordered people would come to New England, along with, so the cream of the crop, the very best hand-picked slaves would come to New England, along with the enslaved people who were unfortunately called the refuse slaves, R-E-F-U-S-E. They were too weak, too sick, too undesirable for whatever reason to be sold in the Caribbean. And so they were brought to New England too, in the hope that they would get well, revive, and be saleable once they arrived here. So this really interesting combination of the very best, hand-picked, hand-ordered, captured Africans coming, along with those that were too sick to be sold otherwise. So where would you buy slaves? Buy them from your neighbors. If someone came upon hard times, the very first thing you would sell is your enslaved person, because they were so valuable and it was easier to sell a person than it was to sell real estate. So you see who was having financial difficulties and maybe purchase someone from them. They were purchased and brought into different households when they were 18 months old. Children were taken from their mothers and brought into a new household at 18 months old. So you'd see who had had a baby in the community and approach that owner and see if the baby was for sale. You could place an order in Newport. You could watch the Newport Mercury for slave ads. And if there was a slave ad, you could go over to Newport on the ferry and go to the place where the slaves were being sold, sometimes in the schoolhouse in Newport, and see if there was anyone there you wanted to purchase. It was very easy.
And our last question for now, what, in your sense of the history, finally turned the tide of public opinion against slavery in the North?
I think, and this is a little bit of a, I think after the Revolution, white families were so poor they couldn't afford to own slaves anymore. And I think that brought about the end of slavery in the North. I don't think it was a big shift in morals. I think it was all money driven. And I think especially the families in Newport, after having been occupied by the British for so many years, couldn't feed everybody in the household. And so that is when we see a lot of enslaved people being freed, just so you didn't have to take care of them any longer. I think that the poverty that followed the Revolution is the real key to the change in the North. Not very altruistic, but I think that's a, if not the reason, it's a major reason. Okay. 9. Yes, people achieved freedom, but freedom did not mean equality, and that is very important to remember. Primus Collins, fascinating example. Prior to our more recent work, looking into Primus's life, and Lise Plimpton was actually the first person to look into Primus Collins' life. Primus used to be sort of the one and only well-known enslaved man in Little Compton. And then we learned, when we actually stopped reading the secondary source stories and actually started doing the real research, Primus was never enslaved in Little Compton. He was not a slave in Little Compton. He was an indentured servant. He was enslaved by the governor of Rhode Island, John Collins, in Newport, until he was 4 years old. And so actually, the perfect example, he was born during the Revolution. John Collins's household was part of the occupation of Newport by the British. As soon as the British left, Governor Collins gave Primus's mother, Phyllis, an enslaved woman, Primus's freedom papers. So he freed Primus. And Primus was sent to William Richmond in Little Compton as an indentured servant at the age of 4. And he was indentured until he was 18 years old. He married a woman named Elizabeth Gray. He was the father of 2 girls, Lucy and Amy, and Primus was a property owner. Now, the old story about Primus says that his owner gave him a farm. Big exaggeration. His owner gave him a 1/4 acre of land, and Primus through his own efforts and labor and 8 different property purchases, amassed a farm of 30 acres. And with that, he was able to support his family. He was literate. He was frequently hired as a grave digger. He may have been the Negro governor. So the Negro governor of Rhode Island was an honorary position. There was a big ceremony over in Newport where people of color would go and line up behind the man that they wanted to be the Negro governor. And so he was sort of their unofficial representative for the year. There are lots of stories that says Primus Collins was the Negro governor. He doesn't appear on any lists of Negro governors, so I just don't know how true that is. But one of the most exciting parts of Primus's story is that he was a voter. Because he was free, because he was male, and because he was a property owner, he fit all of the requirements to vote in Rhode Island. Even though he was Black, even though he was a Negro man, he voted. And newspapers prove that he voted in 1811 and 1817. So that seems like wonderful equality, a great degree of equality. But if you read both newspaper stories make an absolute mockery of his voting. It becomes a joke that a Black man voted. And in the longer of the two stories in 1817, it's really kind of clear that he probably wouldn't have voted, except that the Federalists in Little Compton needed 1 vote in order to win over the Republicans. And so they decided that they were going to let Primus vote so he could be the election altering vote in that election. And the newspaper is pretty clear about that being a shady deal. So Primus achieved more than any enslaved man in Little Compton. He deserved a tremendous amount of respect, and yet we see that he wasn't. The stories that we used to tell about him pretended that he got that respect, but when we read the newspaper stories from the time, we see that it was wishful thinking, that he really was considered the other, less, somehow less entitled to vote than a white man, and kind of a joke. Point number 10, the North purposely misremembered its 200-year history of slavery. Primus's story is an example, but the early histories repeatedly present the story of a very soft, gentle form of slavery that is just not true. It presented slavery as very rare. In Little Compton, our stories repeatedly, because one family wrote down their slavery stories, that single set of stories was just repeated and repeated and repeated. And I think we all started to think that it was just this one white family that owned slaves. And in reality, it was 20% of the families. And the family whose stories were repeated weren't really even one of the bigger slaveholders. So if it gets written down, it gets repeated, and that becomes the history. But if you take the time to look and see what else is there, you'll realize you shouldn't give too much power to those stories that were written down in the 1800s. Those stories tell us that every master was kind, every slave was loyal. In 1840, a wonderful town clerk, Otis Wilbur, he was wonderful in so many ways. He took it upon himself to rewrite all the vital records in Little Compton, because they were written in old script, which is really hard to read, the paper's crumbling. He wrote in beautiful penmanship in these nice brand new books with lines, so it's all easy to read. He purposely stripped out references to slavery and race. He whitewashed those records. And if you decide that you're going to do your research using his beautifully written records, you're not going to get the whole story. You have to go back to those really difficult, really crumbly old records in order to get the truth. The story was misremembered because, especially during the Civil War, we as Northerners wanted to present ourselves as good, the good free white North versus the bad slave-holding South. And so all the stories were written in that way. And it is important for me to say that that idea and a number of the other ideas you're going to be hearing in the next couple of slides are not my ideas. They are the result of the work of a wonderful scholar named Joanne Hope Mellish, who wrote a book called Disowning Slavery. And anyone interested in Rhode Island slavery or New England slavery should read Disowning Slavery. Our stories overstated our abolitionism, making it seem like everybody in the North was against slavery. That really just was not the case. And we in the North viewed our Black residents as outsiders, and we forgot on purpose that just a generation before or 2 generations before, they had been members of our own households. Here is an example of a whitewashed record. This is Sarah Peabody, who we talked about earlier, and her marriage record. At the top, we have the original record, and it clearly says, it shows Caesar with no last name, and he's a Negro, and he's a servant to Nathaniel Church, and servant here is code for slave. Sarah, no last name, Negro, servant to John Peabody. When Otis Wilbur rewrote the record, look at the changes. He gives Caesar and Sarah last names that they really were not using at that time, the names of their owners. And he strips out the word Negro, and he strips out their servitude. So if you came across this record, especially with Sarah Peabody, it's such a old New England name, you lose all sense of race, except for one thing, Caesar. Caesar traditionally was a name given only to enslaved boys and men in New England. You're not going to find a white Caesar at that time in New England. So that was the clue when I read this record that something was wrong. Point number 11, every free person benefited from slavery in the North. I think sometimes it's very tempting to not want to be connected, to be happy when you discover that your family was not a slave-owning family. I think that's very understandable, but I think we also have to understand that non-slave owning families still benefited from the system of slavery that was at work in the North. Everybody enjoyed lower prices because of on goods that they purchased because they were made cheaply due to slave labor. Everybody enjoyed low construction costs for the same reason. And if we today go into a building, a town building, a state building that was built before the end of slavery, we are essentially benefiting from that slave labor as well. New Englanders loved their plantation goods. They loved sugar. They loved rum. And even though the rum might have been manufactured in Newport, it couldn't have been made without the molasses from the islands. Black men filled military quotas for towns. That saved towns from sending their white boys and their white men to war, saving their lives. Black men in the military were given the most dangerous positions, again, saving white lives. Some of us might be here today because a Black man filled our relations quota spot in a colonial war. Black men and women managed farms and households that enabled their owners to go away and do other things. And we touched on that earlier. But if you owned an enslaved man who who was competent and could run your farm for you, that meant you could leave the farm and go do more profitable work, more exciting work, more valuable work, and know that your family was in good hands. Your farm would still be producing. Non-slave owners could rent enslaved people to help at busy times, at harvest times, to help in the wintertime when there wasn't much on their own farm for them to do. So that was a path to very cheap labor. And then also, you know, and this is so appropriate during a time of epidemic, the history of the smallpox vaccine is it was an African practice brought here and explained by an enslaved man to his master, who then replicated it and began the vaccination and began the inoculations for smallpox. Again, an idea that we have to credit Joanne Pope Mellish for in disowning slavery. When slavery ended, racism replaced it as a means of control in the North. Little Compton probably was no more or less racist at any time in its history than any other community in Rhode Island. But it cannot deny a history of racism. A poster from the golf club, 1888, announcing coon songs. A poster from the 1930s offering a minstrel show in the Grange Hall. And in the middle is a really lovely little embroidery, a little cross stitch, probably produced right after the Civil War, and it's celebrating the emancipation of the slaves. And we think, well, you know, that's marvelous. That's not a racist thing. But then we look at the words, and it says, "we's free." So at the same moment it's celebrating freedom, it's also mocking the language of the slaves. So it's not a pure celebratory decoration. It's also a reminder that in this way, white language is better than and more refined than Black language. Oops, let me go back. Ezra Cook's story is one of the more powerful stories that I remember coming across. I'm looking in my book to read it because I have a box that's blocking it on the screen. So let me read it from the book. There were many times, I have to say, when I was moved to tears finding different documents in the archives. Ezra's story is one of them. The source is an oral history interview, a gathering of sort of the elders of Little Compton, and they all sat around and told stories in 1937. And this was a story told by Elizabeth Manchester, who is better known as Lizzie Manchester, and she was part of the Manchester Store family in Adamsville. So this is an Adamsville story. Ezra Cook went to school. He was a genuine African Negro, and his hair grew at both ends. The benches of the older students were rather high, and this teacher thought it was a very brilliant idea to put Ezra in the middle of these stools. One scholar sat this side of Ezra and one that, and they sat there many hours. They were all pinned up in a red and black woolen shawl. Well, sometimes it didn't smell like the best of cologne. The shawl was put around the three heads, and they were all pressed together. Ezra didn't care. He chewed pins. I've often wondered what became of him. We sat there until we were all better children, or worse. I remember that very well. It seems as if I can smell Ezra now. So in 1937, that's what Lizzie Manchester thought was an appropriate, entertaining story. She's telling the story of a teacher using a Black child as punishment for the other children in school, and it's absolutely heartbreaking. And there are points in this story that I think are incredibly important. Lizzie is basically saying, that Ezra was crazy when he says he chewed pins. That's a way of saying he was crazy. But what concerns me even more is that she believed Ezra didn't care. I don't think any of us who are parents, or any of us who've ever loved or cared for a child, or even been a child, would ever believe that you don't care that you're being held apart from the other children in school and used as punishment for your classmates. That's just hideous. And there's evidence that Ezra did care, and there's evidence that his family cared, and the evidence is that they didn't stay. They didn't stay in this area, perhaps for lots of reasons, but one of them would be this was not a good place for their kids to grow up if they were going to be treated this badly in their school. And I know that they didn't stay here because I just can't find them at all. This is around 1870. They're not in that census. They're not in 1860. They're not in 80. They're not in the state censuses. They left. So, not to end on such a sad and negative note, you know, there are ways of making things a little better. And one of the things that I was very happy we were able to do was decide as a historical society that we would place a memorial to the enslaved people of Little Compton in the old burying ground on the Commons. So this first gravestone here is in memory of the more than 200 men, women, and children enslaved in Little Compton from 1674 to 1816. It fits in beautifully with the other gravestones that are all for free people of color who died in Little Compton in the 1800s, and most of these are members of Primus Collins' family. When I took this job, I was taught that this row of gravestones was called Slave Row. When you do the research, you realize that none of these people were slaves when they were buried. They were all free people, and most of them were free people for their entire lives. So yet another example of how the history that is passed down to us has to be questioned and has to be rewritten when appropriate. We owe a great debt of gratitude to a volunteer named Melinda Green, who literally read 300 years of town council notes, and in those 300 years of town council notes found one sentence that talked about a Negro burying ground in Little Compton. So her work confirmed that this western end of the old burying ground on the Commons used to be a distinct Negro burying ground, separate from the white burying ground and separated by a wall. In 1870, that wall was removed. This is where many of Little Compton's enslaved people would have been buried, probably with fieldstone grave markers. After 1870, when that wall was removed, I'm guessing those fieldstone grave markers were also removed. And I'm guessing that the white graves, the graves of white people, started to encroach upon the Negro burying ground. We did a cemetery project a few years ago. We did ground penetrating radar here. There are many unmarked graves in this area. And so I think it is a very appropriate place for the memorial to be placed for people's whose names and burials were just never recorded. And I've included Lucy Collins' photograph here. Lucy Collins' gravestone is this little one. Whoops. Lucy Collins' gravestone is this one right here. Lucy Collins was Primus's daughter, born free, lived her entire life in Little Compton, inherited her parents' farm. She was a farmer. In one of the censuses, she's one of only 2 or 3 women in Little Compton who are actually labeled with the occupation of farmers. And she supported herself here her entire life. My predecessor, Sarah Soule Wilbur, who was a very early local historian for Little Compton, wrote in the 1890s that Lucy Collins was the only native-born Negro person left in Little Compton. So it became a very white community, became a very solitary existence, I think, for the people of color who remained in Little Compton. And when you are the only one, you attract a lot of attention, and Lucy would attract attention. People wrote about her in their diaries as an unusual sighting in Little Compton to see her walk down the road. I think we're very lucky to have her photograph. It puts a face on something that's really, it gives us a face to focus on when you think about 200 people whose faces we'll never know. It's really kind of wonderful to look at Lucy and think of and get a sense of her as a real person. So these are the 12 points. It was my job tonight to try and convince you that they're true. You can be the judge of whether I've done that or not. But we've come to the end of the talk, and again, I'm more than happy to answer any questions people may have.
Okay, so how did the farmers and landowners manage all of the work after emancipation?
So, they would hire help, hire young white boys from other families to come do the work. We have photographs. Oh, and I took it out of the slideshow. That's too bad. Sometimes I keep extra things at the end, and I really should have kept this. I think men of color came to Little Compton as itinerant workers. And so they would come in the summer and work and live in the households, and then probably go to the cities and work in the wintertime. And the reason I think that is because we have a photograph of the Wilbur House, the museum where I work, the house museum where Jenna and I work. And everybody's lined up. The whole household is lined up in front of the Wilbur House outside. Never, ever noticed that two of the people in the picture have very dark skin, and they're dressed in workmen's clothes, not the black suits of the Wilbur family. I think they're black men who were itinerant workers during the summer. I can't catch them in the census. They weren't here long enough to be in censuses. I think they came and went as needed. Then 1870, 80, certainly 1890, Portuguese immigrants come, and they are the new workforce in Little Compton.
So again, reading verbatim because it's a longer question. The more that I learn about slavery, the more it becomes clear that it is inextricably intertwined with wealth. Not just the profit white people made from enslaved people, but the various ways our nation has subsequently denied their descendants access to wealth. If individuals or groups wanted to raise funds for reparations to the descendants of enslaved people in this area, would it be possible to find their families?
A few. We already know a few. I think it would be possible to do more. Yeah, it's possible.
Okay, and that is the last question that I have for now.
Okay, good. Well, I thank you. I thank you all so much for joining us tonight. Difficult, challenging, but very important subject, and I think important to have a talk like this on an anniversary. So So at the very least, we can celebrate the end of slavery in Little Compton. All right, thank you.
I have a late question.
Sure.
Are there any connections between Little Compton and James DeWolf?
Yes. And I just read this, I reread this today, so it's a little fresh in my memory. The gravestone of the slave captain, Oliver Earle, that we saw, I think he was partners with James DeWolf. And actually, that might not be true. Hold on one second. There were two, we've got a slave trade chapter in here. There were some local slave traders, slave captains, who were going out right when the federal government said slave trading was illegal. By the way, and you all know that ships went long after it was illegal because it was just so profitable. Even with the fines, after they paid the fines for breaking the law, they still made a profit. So, and I won't, do you have that person's name? Because I might be able to email it to them just so I know.
Yeah, they responded with, he was a DeWolf slave ship captain.
Oliver Earle?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, that might be what's stuck in my memory. But I was reviewing today, and I did see that DeWolf was somebody's partner, and it was very close to the time of illegal slave trading.
Mm-hmm. And he's added, he had a plantation in Matanzas, Cuba, but I'm not sure if he is Oliver Earle or James DeWolf. So.
And there was a Little Compton connection to a sugar plantation in Cuba long after the end of the slave trade, because slavery in Cuba lasted longer than most of the other areas around here.
Oliver apparently had the plantation in Cuba. DeWolf had 6. So, thank you so much for that information. All right, it looks like we're out of questions. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Jenna, for all your help. All right. So 38 of you stuck all the way to the end. I wish I had a prize for you. Good for you. 2 hours, holy smokes. You deserve a prize. Go have cookies. I think Wendy Merriman has the best snacks, though. She started with ice cream, and now I think she's having a brownie. Go visit
I think
you're
right.
Hi, Eliza. How are you? Good to see you. And Nancy Clark is here. Oh, how fun. Good to see everybody. Tim O'Toole. Marie. If anybody has a last minute question and you want to just turn on your mic and ask it, you're welcome to do that. It gets less crazy with fewer people.
Hi, I'm in the dark, but did you record? Will there be a recording that we can share with other people?
Yeah, it will go onto YouTube.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
The easiest way to find any of our stuff is just to go to littlecompton.org. We've got a landing page. It's not the most, I do it myself. It's not the most attractive thing in the world, but it'll give you links to old videos, new videos, the next workshops, you know, all sorts of things.
There was one story that I missed a little bit of, the Ezra Cook story.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
What were they doing exactly in the classroom?
So they had this little black boy in the classroom, and
Yeah.
the woman telling the story, who was his white classmate, said that he smelled. And the teacher would use him as punishment for the other kids.
Okay, that's what I thought. Yeah, that's
So, I
horrible.
mean, pretty awful.
Yeah.
And I think the worst thing about that is to think that he didn't care. That's the really hard part.
Heartbreaking. Yeah. And doesn't feel so different than something I could imagine now.
I hope, I like to think
I hope not.
that teachers are smarter than that now, or kinder than that
Oh,
now.
right. I guess not from a teacher, but
Yeah.
yeah.
But you know,
That's true.
I'm 50, and you know, so 40 years ago, we had physical punishment and kids getting tied to chairs, and you know, sort of that unhealthy type
Right.
of control in the classroom.
Yeah. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks for joining us.